The smell of burned coffee and old cardboard hit me the moment I stepped into the storage unit. My grandmother had been gone for 6 weeks, and this was the first time I could make myself come here to the place where the last pieces of her life sat in boxes, waiting for someone to decide what they were worth. I was the one who had driven 4 hours to get here. My brother hadn't bothered. He never did. Colton was 32, 3 years older than me, and he moved through the world like it was a stage built specifically for his performance. Broad shoulders, easy smile, the kind of handshake that made men trust him instantly. He was running for city council in Hargrove, the mid-sized Ohio town where we grew up, and his campaign signs were already nailed to telephone poles all over the county. Colton Mercer, a voice for our future. I had driven past 3 of them on the way to this storage unit and felt nothing except a dull, familiar tiredness. My grandmother, Eleanor Mercer, had left behind 2 things of real value. The first was her house on Birchwood Lane, a 1940s craftsman with a wide porch and a peach tree in the backyard that had been producing fruit since before I was born. The second was a savings account with a little over $40,000, meant to be split evenly between Colton and me. The house was different. Her will said it was to go to both of us jointly, to be sold or kept by mutual agreement. I had assumed we would sell it and split the proceeds. The market in Hargrove had gotten surprisingly strong. A developer named Harmon Properties had been buying up the older craftsman homes on that street to convert them into boutique rentals. My grandmother's house, based on comparable sales, was worth somewhere between $350,000 and $400,000. I was not prepared for what I found in that storage unit. It was tucked inside a manila envelope that had been slipped between 2 of my grandmother's old photo albums. The kind of envelope that looked like it had been put there carefully, deliberately, by someone who knew the albums would eventually come to me. My grandmother had always been precise like that. She had a gift for quiet communication. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A quitclaim deed, dated 5 weeks ago, 1 week after she died. It transferred full ownership of the Birchwood Lane property from the joint estate of Colton James Mercer and Mara Lynn Mercer to Colton James Mercer, sole owner. My signature was at the bottom. I had never signed anything. I sat down on a cardboard box and stared at that page for a long time. The storage unit hummed with the sound of a distant ventilation system. My hands were completely steady, which surprised me, because my heart was slamming against my ribs hard enough to bruise. I recognized the forgery immediately. My signature has a very specific quirk. The M in Mara curls back under itself in a loop that I developed in middle school and have never been able to shake. The signature on that deed had the loop, but it was on the wrong side. Whoever copied my signature had held it up to a window or a light source and traced it from the reverse. Colton always did have beautiful, careful hands. He had played piano for 12 years. I drove to my parents' house that evening. I sat across from them at the kitchen table where I had eaten 1,000 meals, and I placed the deed on the surface between us. My mother stared at it. My father picked it up. He read it slowly, the way he read everything. Then he set it back down and folded his hands. I said, "This is a forged signature. I need to know if you knew about this." My mother looked at my father. My father looked at the table. The silence was its own kind of answer. My mother spoke first. She said Colton had already accepted an offer from Harmon Properties. $790,000. The sale was closing in 3 weeks. She said it in the same tone she used to announce dinner was ready, like the information itself was neutral, like the moral weight of it didn't exist. I said, "He sold my grandmother's house, without my knowledge, using a forged document. That is deed fraud. That is a felony." My father said, "Mara, I need you to listen carefully." What followed was a conversation I will spend years trying to forget. My father explained, in the measured voice he used for difficult negotiations, that Colton's engagement to Diane Albright, daughter of Richard Albright, Hargrove's most prominent real estate attorney, and the man who had essentially built Colton's campaign infrastructure from the ground up, was 4 months away. He explained that Colton needed a financial foundation to establish himself as a credible candidate and a stable future husband. He explained that a fraud investigation against Colton, in an election year, in a town where the Albright family had deep roots, would not just end Colton's political career. It would end his engagement. It would end his life as he had built it. My mother said, "You've always been the resilient one, Mara. Colton needs this more than you do, I said. He stole from me. My father said, we will make it right eventually. After the election. After the wedding. We will figure something out. I asked what figure something out meant. He did not have an answer. My mother suggested perhaps Colton could pay me back gradually over time from council earnings. She said this while looking at the centerpiece on the table. A small vase of dried lavender that had been there so long it had faded to gray. I said no. I said I was going to report this. My father's voice changed then. It lost its measured quality. He said that if I reported it, the notary involved would claim she had witnessed my signature in person. He said the notary was a woman named Patricia Gould, who had processed paperwork for my father's construction business for 20 years, who owed him more than one favor, and who would not contradict her own notarization under oath without considerable proof. My mother said, it will be your word against hers, and against his. And then what? You destroy this family for what? For a house you didn't even visit for 2 years? I had visited every summer. I had visited when my grandmother got sick. I had been there the week before she died, sleeping on her couch and making her soup and reading to her from the mystery novels she loved. My brother had sent flowers. I said nothing. I took the deed, and I left. That night, I called the county recorder's office and confirmed that the deed had been officially recorded. The sale to Harmon Properties was pending but not yet closed. I had a narrow window. I called a real estate attorney named Olivia Grant the next morning. She was not in my family's social circle. She had been recommended to me by a coworker 2 years earlier, and I had kept her number in my phone without knowing why. She listened to everything I said, asked 3 precise questions, and told me I had a viable case for deed fraud and forgery, but that without evidence of the forgery itself, not just my assertion, the notary's stamp would create serious complications. She said I needed something concrete, a timestamp, a witness, anything that proved I was not present when my signature was supposedly obtained. I thought back to 5 weeks ago. 1 week after my grandmother's funeral, I had been in Cincinnati. My company, a mid-sized graphic design firm, had held its annual client summit at the Westin downtown. I had been there for 3 days. I had my conference badge, my hotel folio, my expense receipts. I had given a 20-minute presentation to 40 people on the second day, but the deed was dated on a Tuesday. I needed to know what time Patricia Gould had supposedly witnessed my signature on that Tuesday. I requested a copy of the recorded deed from the county. The notarization timestamp read 2:14 p.m. At 2:14 p.m. on that Tuesday, I had been standing in front of a projection screen in a Cincinnati hotel conference room explaining typography choices to a room full of marketing executives. I had the presentation recording. I had the attendance log. I had a hotel keycard timestamp showing I had re-entered my room at 4:47 p.m. I had an alibi that was airtight, documented, and independent. I brought all of it to Olivia Grant. She got very quiet in the way that lawyers get quiet when something has shifted in their favor. She said we needed to move carefully and quickly. She filed an emergency injunction to halt the Harmon Properties sale. The court granted a temporary stay within 48 hours. Colton called me that same evening. I did not recognize his voice at first because I had never heard it sound like that, stripped of its easy confidence, reduced to something thin and urgent. He said, "You need to drop this." I said, "No." He said my father had spoken to Richard Albright. He said Richard was already concerned about the optics. He said Diane was devastated. He said if this went forward, if this became public, it would not just be him who suffered. He reminded me that my mother had a heart condition. He said the stress alone could, and then he stopped himself before finishing the sentence. But I heard it anyway, the implication hanging there between us like something rotten. I said, "Did you just imply that I might cause our mother to have a heart attack if I report your felony?" He said, "I'm saying think about the whole family, Mara, not just yourself." I said, "I'll think about it." I did not drop it. 3 days later, I arrived home from Olivia's office to find that my laptop was missing. I lived alone in an apartment 20 minutes from my parents' house. There was no sign of forced entry. The only other person who had a key was my mother, who had held a spare since I moved in, for emergencies. My laptop had contained my backed-up copies of the conference materials, the presentation file, the email threads confirming my attendance, the photos I had taken during the summit. I sat in the middle of my kitchen and worked very hard at not falling apart. Then I remembered something. 6 months earlier, my grandmother had asked me to help her set up a smart home security system. She had been nervous after a neighbor's package was stolen off a porch. We had spent an afternoon together installing 4 small cameras, front door, back door, driveway, and one covering the side gate, and linking them all to a cloud account through the system's app. The account was registered under her email address, which she had set up years ago with my help, and which she had never, to my knowledge, shared with Colton or my parents. The system automatically stored motion-triggered footage to the cloud for 60 days. The notarization had happened 5 weeks ago. I was still within the window. My grandmother's email password was the name of her childhood dog, followed by the year she was married. She had told me once because she always forgot it. I sat at my kitchen table with my phone and typed it from memory. The account opened. The cloud storage for the security system showed 41 days of archived footage. I navigated to the date of the notarization, Tuesday, and I filtered by the front door camera, because that was the camera that faced Birchwood Lane, that captured everyone who came and went. At 1:52 p.m., a car pulled up. A woman got out carrying a leather folio. She walked to the front door and knocked. Colton opened it. He had a key. He had always had a key to our grandmother's house. Same as me. Same as our parents. The woman was Patricia Gould. They were inside for 19 minutes. At 2:11 p.m., Patricia Gould came back out. She got in her car and drove away. At 2:14, the timestamp on the notarization said my signature had been witnessed. I was in Cincinnati. The camera on the front door had captured the face of every person who entered and exited that house on that day. Patricia Gould's face was clear. Colton's face was clear. The timestamp on the footage was automatic, server-generated, and legally timestamped through the security company's cloud infrastructure. There was no version of this where I had been there, but there was more. Because my grandmother had also installed the camera at the back door, and at 2:03 p.m., while Patricia Gould was presumably inside, notarizing a document, the back door camera caught Colton stepping out onto the porch with his phone to his ear. The audio was faint, but the microphone on the camera was better than I expected. I turned up my phone volume all the way. I heard him say, "She won't find out. She barely paid attention to Grandma's stuff. I already checked, and she doesn't have a key to the storage unit. I changed the lock." He paused. Then he said, "Yeah, the notary is inside right now. It's done, Richard. It's done." Richard Albright, his future father-in-law, the man whose endorsement had launched his campaign. I forwarded the cloud footage to Olivia Grant at 11:47 p.m. I forwarded it to the county recorder's office fraud hotline. I forwarded it to the Ohio Attorney General's office real estate fraud division. And then, because I thought very carefully about who else needed to know, I forwarded it to the managing editor of the Hargrove Courier, the local paper, with a note explaining the context and attaching the documentation showing my presence in Cincinnati. Then I sat on my kitchen floor for a while. I ate a granola bar. I watched the ceiling. In the morning, my phone had 14 missed calls. 4 from Colton, 3 from my mother, 2 from my father, 1 from a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be Richard Albright's personal cell, 1 from Olivia Grant, who had left a voicemail saying, "Call me as soon as you're awake, we have a lot of movement," and 1 from a reporter at the Courier named James Whitfield, who said he had reviewed the materials and had some questions when I was available. I called Olivia first. She told me the Attorney General's office had already been in contact with her. The county recorder had flagged the deed for review pending investigation. The temporary injunction on the Harmon Properties sale had been converted to a full halt. Patricia Gould, upon being contacted informally through channels Olivia would not specify but implied, involved a phone call that had made the notary very uncomfortable, had indicated she might be open to cooperating with investigators in exchange for considerations regarding her own exposure. I called my grandmother's neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Finch, who had lived next door for 30 years, who had helped my grandmother pick out the security system, and who had always kept a spare key to the cloud account login written on a note card in her kitchen drawer because, as she put it, Eleanor always forgot her passwords. Mrs. Finch confirmed she had never given that login to anyone. She also confirmed she had seen Colton's car on Birchwood Lane on the afternoon in question, which she hadn't thought was unusual at the time. The Hargrove Courier ran the story 4 days later. James Whitfield was thorough and careful. The headline read, "City Council candidate Colton Mercer faces deed fraud investigation tied to late mother's estate." The cloud footage stills were included, Colton opening the door for Patricia Gould. The timestamp, the phone call on the back porch. The Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation within the week. The civil complaint filed on my behalf by Olivia Grant named Colton Mercer for deed fraud, forgery of a notarial document, and civil theft. It named Patricia Gould as a co-conspirator. Based on Colton's recorded phone call, the investigation expanded to examine Richard Albright's potential knowledge of and involvement in the scheme, which created a complication I had not anticipated, but which Olivia described as an additional layer of accountability. Diane Albright released a statement through her father's office, saying the engagement was paused, pending the outcome of the investigation. The statement was 3 sentences long. I did not find it satisfying or unsatisfying. I did not think about Diane much at all. Colton withdrew from the city council race on a Thursday. He released no statement. His campaign signs disappeared from the telephone poles within 48 hours, which suggested that someone had organized their removal quickly and quietly, the way you remove evidence of something that had never worked out. My parents called me the night the story ran in the Courier. My father said, "You didn't have to do it this way." My mother was crying in the background, not speaking, just present in the sound of her own grief. I understood that their grief was not for me. It was for the version of Colton they had invested in, the version of the future they had arranged around him, the image that had now been publicly and permanently damaged. I said, "I asked you to help me, and you told me to be quiet for his benefit. I gave you that choice." My father said, "Mara," I said, "I hope you understand that you made yours." I hung up and did not feel the relief I expected. What I felt was something quieter and more permanent, not triumph, more like the feeling of a door finally closing on a draft that had been blowing cold for a very long time. The criminal charges were filed 2 months later. Colton was charged with 1 count of deed fraud and 1 count of forgery of an official notarial document, both felonies under Ohio law. Patricia Gould was charged with 1 count of notarial misconduct and 1 count of making a false official statement. She cooperated. Her attorney confirmed she had been approached by Colton and offered $2,000 to process the document without requiring both parties to be present. She had done it twice before for my father's business on documents of lesser consequence and had assumed this was similarly routine. The Harmon property's sale was voided. The property returned to the joint estate. With the injunction lifted and the title cleared, Olivia negotiated a legitimate sale to a different buyer, a young couple who wanted to restore the house, who walked through it and fell in love with the peach tree in the backyard. The house sold for $412,000. My half came to $206,000. At Colton's sentencing hearing, I was asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement. I had written one and then deleted it 4 times. What I brought to the courthouse was a single page, and I read it in less than 3 minutes. I said that my grandmother worked for decades to build something she could leave to the people she loved. I said that she trusted her family to honor that intention. I said that what my brother did was not a mistake or a lapse in judgment. It was a plan, executed carefully, over time, using her death as an opportunity and my absence as an assumption. I said that the thing he had forgotten, the tiny, ordinary detail he had overlooked, was that my grandmother loved her home enough to keep a record of everyone who came through its doors. Colton received 2 years of probation, a substantial fine, full restitution to me, equal to the value of my share of the estate plus damages, and 150 hours of community service. Patricia Gould received 1 year of probation and had her notarial commission permanently revoked. Richard Albright was not charged. The investigation found his knowledge of the scheme was probable but not sufficiently documentable, but the exposure had consequences of its own variety. 3 of his major commercial clients quietly moved their representation elsewhere in the following quarter. My parents did not attend the sentencing. I did not know whether that was because they couldn't face it, or because they thought their absence would somehow soften things for Colton. It didn't matter either way. What I kept, when everything was finished and the accounts were settled and the paperwork was filed, was the security camera from my grandmother's back door. It was a small thing, black plastic, no bigger than a fist. I cleaned it, and put it in a box with some of her other things, a photograph of her as a young woman in a garden, the mystery novels with her handwritten margin notes, a recipe card in her handwriting for the peach preserves she made every fall. The last time I had sat with her, a week before she died, she had held my hand and said, "You always were the one who paid attention, Mara. Don't let anyone make you feel small for that." I had thought she meant it generally. I think she might have meant it specifically. I think, in the way that people who are very old and very clear-eyed sometimes know things they cannot articulate. She might have understood that attention was going to matter. I put the camera in the box and closed the lid. I kept the peach tree, in a sense. The couple who bought the house sent me a jar of preserves that fall, made from the fruit, with a handwritten note that said, "We're taking good care of it." I set it on my kitchen counter and looked at it for a long time. Then I made toast, and I opened the jar, and I sat in my kitchen in the quiet morning light, eating something that tasted like my grandmother's backyard in July, and I thought, I paid attention, and it was enough.